I just spent over 200 hours learning 3D, so this is the story of everything I did and all the lessons that I learned. Disclaimer, this isn't my first 200 hours. I have a bit of experience with Blender, but I'm basically a beginner with Unreal Engine, so let's get to it. The first 100 hours or so I spent following this book, and you'll see why later. Step 1, I'm modelling this drone in Blender without too much difficulty, learning a couple new modelling tips but nothing crazy. I'm basically just tracing an image in 3D for around 5 hours. Next, I'm creating this alien plant through sculpting, which is my weaker skill. The book explains how to use the mask tool in combination with the mesh filter inflate tool to make the top bits pop out, giving it some more volume. This was really time consuming though, because I was sitting there for hours manually placing each bump like a zombie. I could feel the improvement though, so I added a decimate modifier and put it into this software called Instant Meshes to retopologize it, which turned out to be pretty simple to use. The next step is UV maps and texture baking, which completely fried my brain. I should point out that I had a massive ChatGPT conversation going basically the entire time of this project, where I'm constantly asking questions and trying to get my head around these concepts. Before I can start texture baking though, I need to UV unwrap, which is cutting up my 3D model into 2D planes so that I can put textures and images onto it. Marking the UV seams for the plant were pretty simple because the mesh was easy to work with, but doing the same thing for the robot drone turned out to be a lot more tricky because it had so many different objects for each part, and I think I skipped a step somewhere in the tutorial just to make it even harder. I managed to get a UV map that I thought would work for the drone by using the average island scale, then made a low poly version of the drone so I could texture bake it, which is basically adding the details from the high poly model to a low poly model for using various maps so that the low poly model will look detailed when it isn't, to make it run faster in games. The software I was doing this in was called Xnormal, and it really made me grit my teeth. At this point I didn't even understand texture baking fully, and I would either be waiting there for like 2 hours to make one map that turns the low poly model into something from a horror movie, or it would just spit error messages back into my face. So after I spent way too long trying to get this to work, I just gave up and had the realization that I don't even need to do it, when I can delete the problem entirely by just using the high poly one in Unreal. After that I decided to try using Xnormal on the plant model, so I put it in with the high and low poly version, and it works perfectly straight away. Maybe I can use the software and just blame my UVs for the other one not working. I'm clicking randomly in another new software called Quixel Mixer, which is for adding some textures to these models, but then I realized I have no clue what I'm doing, so I head onto YouTube and find this playlist by people who have made the software explaining all the fundamentals. I grind through it now when I head back into Quixel Mixer. I'm feeling confident to make some cool textures. Starting out with the plant, I use a wood texture, smart material as a base, then use the position gradient to make a nice color transition, and I really like the way this was looking in no time. Then for the drone, I used a blue rusted metal texture and overlaid the lines pattern on top so it wrapped around the drone nicely. Again, very simple and very good. I exported both of these now in Unreal Engine 5 with a few clicks and a bit of adjusting for the settings. I have them textured in with a simple material that I just connected the different maps up to. Easy, right? Right? We'll get to that later. The next step is using metahumans for a character in the game, and these are super cool. It's a collection of realistic, fully rigged human characters that you can use for free and customize, which is all browser based. I just go and ask for permission to access it, and now I have this simple UI that's pretty much just a character customizer from a video game. You choose the outfit, body type, hairstyle, and all the smallest details, and it's done. So now I just download it and put it into Unreal, and why are they bold? I can't fix it, which means it's a new feature. Onto building the environment, I get a simple terrain from the book to download and slap in a post-process volume to make everything look a bit nicer. The real godsend for building this environment is what's called Quixel Bridge. It's a completely free library of thousands of super realistic scanned assets from all over the world that I can just import directly into Unreal Engine. It's like Lego blocks. I change their color a little, then drop them into the scene and move them about to where they look best. I also duplicate and scale the plant a few times so it looks scattered around the environment. And at this point I'm just breezing through it. The lighting and atmosphere. I turned on global illumination a little while ago, which made everything look nice. Combined with Lumen has been making things run really fast, and these are some of the huge benefits of Unreal Engine. I set up some classic 3-point lighting using the light sources in Unreal, and then by adding a sky atmosphere, some exponential height fog, light rays from the sun, and adjusting quite a few settings, the difference it makes is huge with how much more cinematic and beautiful everything looks. This is about where the fun ends for a little while. The next step wasn't too bad of heading back into Blender to add some armature to the plant, mesh and drone. It was nice to do. I learned about tools like Symmetrize, which is really useful, and the bone system in general was really intuitive to set up. Although I had a bit of trouble with the weight painting at first, I got it working pretty quickly. And it was cool to see the things I modelled now be able to move about in all these different ways. Maybe in too many different ways. I'm having a bit of trouble getting the lower arm to rotate right, as it's making the hand tiny whenever I rotate it. After a few more hours of troubleshooting and redoing it, I still can't fix the problem. So once again I just decided to go with it and work around it by not making the lower arm rotate in the final animation. It all worked perfectly for the plant once again though, so I'm at least feeling good about that. Now this next step is what completely destroyed me. I followed the book and go through changing some settings as I export this from Blender into Unreal so that it's supposed to make it work because of the differences in the way the 3D software calculates different things like size and rotation. So I put it into Unreal and go into the control rig editor, because the next step is to add what's called a control rig, which is used in 3D to make it easier to animate the characters, because it has like guides for each of the bones instead of the actual bones that you need to move. And it uses complicated math stuff called inverse kinematics, so that if you move the foot and leg, the knee will move accordingly, and same with the hand. But as soon as I get the model open in this workspace, stuff is already messed up. The model was tiny, like super small, and when I try to make the control rig, everything just starts burning down. I tried to change the size of one of the controllers and all of the rest change as well. I tried to move it and it teleports off the map. I spent a good 20 hours at least trying to figure out what the heck is going on. I watched tutorials, re-import the mesh and everything, but nothing's working. I eventually figure out some strange solution that's kinda smart, where I use nodes to adjust the scale of it so that it kinda works, apart from the fact controllers are like 10 times too responsive. At this point I don't even care though, because I found something that works so I can deal with it. By the way, these absolutely did not have inverse kinematics. After those brain-numbing problems, I'm using the sequencer to actually create the animations. It's a bit janky with how bad the control rig is, but I like the sequencer and it's working well enough as a way to create these animations. Now once again I can't have things work for long, so the next step of trying to use Mixamo mocap animations just completely went wrong. I followed the tutorial in the book which got the animations working in Unreal, but then I have to retarget them to the MetaHuman, which was a massive challenge. The same buttons weren't there, and when I did find some buttons to do something, it created an absolute mess with body parts everywhere. After a lot of hours of troubleshooting, once again I couldn't find any solutions, so I decided to just scrap the Mixamo idea and instead tried to make all the animations myself from scratch, because I was that desperate to get something to work. So I used the control rig that comes with the MetaHuman that's very well made and started keyframing everything in the sequencer. I had a few problems where I'd make the keyframes and occasionally the entire animation would just disappear, so I'd have to make it again, but I found some weird workarounds so that it stopped happening. Now I'm onto this first stretch of what's probably much more than 100 hours. I'm in the sequencer combining all the already made animations, then I go on to the final part, which is the camera movement. This is super nice to do, and choosing some shots that will look good and combining them lets you finally see your animation come to life. I also played around with some of the camera settings, like at one point I keyframed it so that the camera gets a super wide view of the world to create a cool shot and then goes back to normal, which I really liked. Apart from the fact that the MetaHuman just stood there and did not animate at all in the render. I think it still looks fine though, so I just left it as it is, then quickly added a few sound effects and music in Premiere Pro. You can see the final video on my channel here. Now I'm going on to this book on modelling, in which I'm thinking if I stay focused on learning specific things I can make more progress. The guy who wrote this book is really good and I was learning a ton from it. The way that the modelling is done is by not being too worried about getting perfect quads everywhere and using new objects whenever you need to add more parts, but getting the result quickly looking really good. I learned a ton of things and I was trying to not copy the tutorial exactly one for one by skipping ahead at times and trying to figure out the changes myself, or just skimming over a decent amount and then trying to make it without looking back at the book. I felt it was working and I was really getting into the flow of it. I learned about the V shortcut to rip vertices for the first time, and the shrink wrap modifier to create the fan on the side was a bit fiddly at first, but it was pretty helpful once I started to understand it. So the model's looking great, but I want to add some texture. The procedural textures you can get by using nodes in Blender are pretty cool, so I want to learn that. I just head onto YouTube, find this guy called Ryan King Art who has a massive playlist with over 100 procedural texture tutorial videos in Blender. So I just follow a few of those and apply each texture to a different part of the gun until it's fully textured. Then I add a camera, some lights and a simple animation to showcase it. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I enjoyed the process of making it as well. For the last few hours I played around with some different stuff that I wanted to come back to. I added a rig to this Sanji and then Luffy model, which I then skinned so that I could animate them easily in Blender if I wanted, but mostly just to practice my rigging because I felt I could do better from the first time. So I'm much more happy with how these work. I modelled some random broken down houses without the help of any tutorials to practice my modelling a bit more, and learnt about how to use the array modifier while at it. And then finally I did a few more texturing tutorials, trying to just watch the tutorial through once, and then after I forgot half of what I just watched, still figure out how to make it myself by using my own skill. Some of the times I ended up doing a different method to the tutorial, but still getting the same end result, which I'm happy about. So that's it, 200 hours learning various 3D software condensed into however many minutes this video is. I hope you learned something or at least enjoyed.